Theoretically, I'm supposed to get through in 3 lectures through the Progressive Era, from the colonial period, which is a lot of material to cover. I want to spend a little bit of time discussing my general approach to history, history generally, specifically American history. I want to begin with a quotation from the great British historian of the 19th century, Lord Acton. Lord Acton was one of the best known of the English historians. I think Ralph Raico will be discussing him in his History of Classical Liberalism. Acton said, "I exhort you never to debase the moral currency or to lower the standard of rectitude, but to try others by the final maxim that governs your own lives, and to suffer no man and no cause to escape the undying penalty which history has the power to inflict on wrong." Close quote. Now, elsewhere, Acton referred to history as a hanging judge. Acton was making a very important point about the role of history and the use that we can make of history. He was not suggesting that we use history for propaganda, that we inject our value judgments and allow those to distort our view of history. He was saying instead that when good history is done, it teaches us something more than just facts about the past. There's something we can learn about the present. And in so many instances, from a moral point of view, extremely villainous characters obviously have gotten away with crimes. One thing the historian can do is try to set the record straight. As I'll be discussing later, one of the interesting things about the American colonial mind was the intense interest that all of these people had in history. Roman, Greek history. The colonials referred to history as the lamp of experience. They thought there was a good deal you could learn from it. Specifically, one could look at the history of free societies and try to understand why, in so many cases, relatively free societies have degenerated into tyrannies or into some form of despotism. That was one among many of the lessons they thought one could learn from history. Now, let me make a few remarks about certain conflicts of historical interpretation that crop up now and again. As you may know, those of you familiar with history, there are so-called schools of historical interpretation. There are economic schools, or so-called ideological schools. These conflicts come down to a matter of philosophical beliefs about what motivate human beings. Are human beings motivated by economic interests? Are they motivated by moral values? Are they motivated by philosophic principles? What is it that causes human beings to act? Well, I'm not going to take a position on this in the sense of opposing the economic school in favor of another school. I think if you understand, for example, the Austrian point of view about motivation, about what motivates people, obviously what motivates all of us is our subjective evaluation of the external world. What we need, what we desire, we act on our subjective perceptions, whether those perceptions are right or wrong. And if it's true of us, it's equally true of people who lived hundreds of years ago. This has very important implications for the so-called economic interpretation of history. I think it's a mistake to talk about a person's economic interests as if that is somehow different from his moral interests and other interests. In other words, we may look back on a person and say, this person was motivated by economic interests rather than by ideology. But most people tend to combine the two in their own minds. We tend to think of our economic interests being coincidental with our moral interests. We don't compartmentalize usually in our own minds when we act. So this gets very important because when I deal with heroes and villains in American history, I usually take these people at their word. If Alexander Hamilton says, I did such and such for this and that reason, I take Alexander Hamilton at his word, unless there's some overwhelming evidence to the contrary. If Thomas Jefferson says, I did such and such, I do the same thing. This will become more important as we proceed, but I want to state at the outset that I'm not pushing any particular type of historical methodology. I think it depends on the case in question. We have to examine each particular case. Now, obviously, people lie throughout history just as they lie today, and if their evidence exists that they are lying, then we should take that into account. But otherwise, I think we can more or less take them at their word. Now, I'm going to begin with the American Revolution. I'm not going to say much about the colonial period prior to the American Revolution, except insofar as it relates to the American Revolution. To try to do that, to cover that 150 years plus, would simply be impossible in this amount of time. And I'm going to focus not so much on the events of the American Revolution itself, the war with England, although I hope I have time to discuss some of the controversies about that. I'm going to discuss more the ideological background, the theory behind it, what motivated the people who fought it. Let me begin by citing a very famous passage, you may have heard this before, from John Adams in a famous letter to Thomas Jefferson written around 1815. Now, there's a whole history of Adams and Jefferson that I may get into later. They were close friends in the early days of the Revolution. They later were bitter political enemies, and then later reconciled as old men. And Adams wrote to Jefferson, quote, "What do we mean by the Revolution? The war? That was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The Revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington." Jefferson entirely agreed with this analysis that the real American Revolution was an ideological revolution. The war came as a result of this ideological revolution, but the war was not essential to the revolution. The revolution could have occurred, and indeed these men wished it had occurred, without violent conflict. This becomes very important in the theory of revolution held by our 18th century forefathers, at least those of us who are Americans, because their idea of revolution, as I shall explain later, had nothing intrinsically to do with violence. Elsewhere, Adams repeated essentially the same sentiment when he said, "This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." These revolutionaries were also convinced that they were true revolutionaries, contrary to English theorists like Edmund Burke, who thought the American Revolution was not a real American Revolution, it was a defense of traditional values. This really wasn't to the point. Burke's criticism was really not to the point. And not only did the American revolutionaries see the American Revolution as a real American Revolution, they saw it as the inspiration for the French Revolution eventually, and hopefully for revolutions throughout the world. One has to understand that the radical Republicans, as they were sometimes called, the Jeffersonians, these people were more or less the Bolsheviks of their day. They wanted to export revolution in the cause of liberty. That's why Paine went over to France after the American Revolution. When Jefferson was over there as ambassador, he was probably conspiring as part of the early stages of the French Revolution. John Adams also had a comment about this. He said in later life, in 1815, "The last 25 years of the last century and the first 15 years of this century may be called the age of revolutions and constitutions." He concludes, "We began the dance." Now, Adams is sometimes viewed as a conservative, and indeed he became a conservative, became a federalist of sorts. But at this stage, he was quite radical, as were most of the individuals involved in the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to be returning to the theory of revolution held by these individuals and its implications, but I'm going to move on now to other things. It's probably appropriate that I should be giving this talk on July 2nd, since those of you familiar with American history know that that day, July 2nd, is the day that American independence was actually declared by the Continental Congress in 1776. John Adams liked to prophesy. He saw himself something as an amateur prophet, and he wrote a famous letter to his wife Abigail where he goes on and on about this 2nd of July will be a day of celebration for Americans. There will be festivities, horns, parades, pomp, and he goes on and on. Well, wrong again, John. He missed it by 2 days. This gets into the problem of, well, why do we celebrate independence on July 4th? Well, Jefferson, who authored the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the edited version of the Declaration was formally adopted on July 4th. But the Declaration of Independence did not declare independence. It simply gave the reasons for an independence which had already been declared. It provided the justification, the rationale. Independence was officially declared by the Continental Congress based on a motion by Richard Henry Lee some weeks before on July 2nd. There's also a controversy about whether the signing by the delegates took place on July 4th. This is one of those great murky areas in American history. Many historians, many reputable historians, in fact probably most, have rejected this story of a 4th of July signing by delegates. They give various reasons. There's no record of this in the records of the Continental Congress. We have no 4th of July document which is signed by the delegates. They claim that the only real signing by delegates took place on August 2nd, when the so-called parchment version it was engrossed on parchment and it was signed by the delegates. That's the famous scene you see in this picture with all the delegates going up and signing one by one. The problem is that 2 eyewitnesses, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, in their later life, both claimed that a signing did in fact occur on the 4th of July. Jefferson produced as evidence notes which he said were taken virtually as the events occurred. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on this. It's an interesting historical question. Who do we accept on this? It's one of those interesting questions of interpretation. But for those of you who wonder about this story and have heard about it, the 4th of July signing, there are some very serious problems associated with it. Now, when I said it's appropriate that we should be doing this lecture on July 2nd, it's particularly appropriate because I'll be discussing quite a bit the Declaration of Independence, because I think the Declaration of Independence is without question the greatest revolutionary document ever written, certainly in America. And it is a revolutionary document. I mean, it is an extremely revolutionary document. It crystallizes in a very elegant, concise way the philosophy of revolution held by this entire tradition that Jefferson came out of. Jefferson called this tradition, this general tradition, the Whig tradition. This is the term he used. Now, Whig, as you may know, was the name of a political party in England, but this isn't what Jefferson meant by it. He meant a tradition, not a party. The so-called, now let me also explain that this is not the term that's used today, because there are a lot of English theoreticians who call themselves Whigs, and therefore modern historians, to distinguish this tradition from its more conservative elements, usually call it the radical Whig tradition, or it's also known as the real Whig tradition. So what Jefferson meant by Whig, we would today call the radical Whig, to distinguish it, for example, from an Edmund Burke, who was a more conservative Whig. This radical Whig doctrine dates far before the American Revolution. It has a long and honorable intellectual history. For our purposes, we can trace it back as an organized, systematized body of political theory back to the 1640s in England, particularly to a group of people called the Levelers. Now, the Levelers were involved in the English Civil War, that is, the fight against Charles I. They fought on the side of Cromwell, who later turned against them because they were so radical. People like Richard Overton, John Lilburn, there's a long list of these Levelers. They were very active in the so-called New Model Army. They were probably the first self-conscious, meaning articulate, group of libertarians that we know of. Not that you can't find certain principles of natural rights and social contract in earlier writers, but this group puts them all together and draws extremely radical political implications. They wrote extensively. It's questionable how much influence their writing had on later people like John Locke, but there may have been some. Certainly they established a tradition. In 1649, Charles I was executed. The so-called Commonwealth was instituted in England under Cromwell, later turned into a so-called protectorate. In 1660, the Restoration occurred, which brought the Stuarts back. Now, I'm giving you this background in English history because it's very important. Once the Stuart monarchy is restored, the entire philosophy associated with the Levelers becomes discredited. It becomes associated with the right of revolution, it becomes associated with the right of tyrannicide, or regicide, to use a more neutral term, the right to kill a king. There's this whole period in time when this radical philosophy of natural rights, social contract, meaning government based on consent, becomes very discredited because it's traced back to the killing of the beloved Charles I. See what I'm getting at here? But in the 1680s, there emerged another group of writers in this tradition. The best known, and I'm sure you've all heard of him, John Locke, is in this tradition. John Locke was a physician. He saved the life of Lord Shaftesbury, one of the founders of the Whig Party in England, through surgery, and it apparently was quite remarkable for its day. He fell into this radical circle of political writers. Lord Shaftesbury more or less kept a stable of writers and intellectuals around him, a form of patronage, which was very common in those days. And Locke, in the 1680s, wrote his famous Two Treatises of Government, probably the single most influential book in terms of theory on the American colonials. Very, very important. Not that all of them read it, but the ideas expressed were known by all the colonists in the 18th century. This was part of by the way, a problem called the exclusion crisis, which I won't go into. There's a reason Locke wrote this when he did. But this radical Whig tradition experiences a revival in the 1680s in England. And another very important figure, greatly admired in the colonies that I'm going to be dealing with a little bit, is Algernon Sidney, a name you may not be familiar with. He is also part of this radical Whig tradition. Algernon Sidney was what is sometimes known as a radical Whig or a Commonwealthman. And he was executed by the Stuarts for sedition. I think it was 1683, for allegedly conspiring in the famous Rye House plot, which they claimed was in a conspiracy to kill the king and his brother. It's not clear whether that was even a plot or not. Sidney wrote a famous book called Discourses Concerning Government, And this became an extremely important influence on Americans. Jefferson, when he talks about the ideology of the American Revolution, always refers, or almost always refers, to Locke and Sidney in the same breath. Sidney was called Sidney the Martyr, and his discourses concerning government was a veritable textbook of revolution, because far more even than Locke, Sidney insisted not only on the right of revolution, but on the duty of revolution against oppressive or tyrannical governments. Now, it's one thing to sit in this classroom in the 20th century and talk about the right of revolution, the right of regicide in the 17th century, and we might think, well, so what? What's the big deal now? I mean, who's going to defend tyrants and monarchs? To put this in context, I think to appreciate how radical these doctrines were seen at the time, and quite properly so, an Algernon Sidney writing today would be the equivalent of someone writing defending the right to assassinate the President of the United States. Now, if you kind of shirk back at that a little bit, it was even worse in the 17th century because the king was thought to have divine sanction. So if that bothers you, imagine how these writers in the 17th century talking literally about the right to kill a tyrant or a king. This is how they were perceived, as being very, very radical, and they were. I have to emphasize this because there are certain historians who tend to downplay the radical edge of this tradition. These people were killed, they were involved in revolts and rebellions, they knew their life was on the line in many cases. Let me give you one example, it's a bit of a digression, but how history can be very distorted, or the history of political theory can be very distorted if you don't understand the historical context. I remember when I was in college, and I've read this in books as well, it wasn't just this one professor, a discussion arose as to why when John Locke wrote his two treatises of government, he kept the manuscripts secret. He didn't want anyone to know about them, and when they were published anonymously. Now, why didn't he sign his name to them? Why did he keep them a secret? The explanation commonly given, at least when I was reading this material originally, was that John Locke was a shy fellow who didn't like to get involved in controversies. He didn't want to have to argue with anyone. He wanted to kind of keep his name out of it. Well, that might fit a 20th century interpretation of not wanting to have to reply to scholarly criticism, but John Locke, who knew of Algernon Sidney's fate and wrote about it, had to flee to Holland to escape the same fate himself, because he too was about to be implicated in the Rye House plot. He burned a lot of his papers, he fled to Holland, and did not return until after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the Stuarts were kicked out. Now, it seems to me that's a far more plausible explanation as to why he wrote this anonymously and why he wanted to keep it a secret. Because it was advocating the right of revolution. Algernon Sidney, who had done the same thing, had just recently had his head cut off. That seems to me a more plausible interpretation than simply saying he was shy and he didn't want to get involved in controversy. So I'm trying to give you some perspective on this. What I want to do now is run through the general principles of this tradition. I'll mention just one other group of people before I do. Ed mentioned this group, these two men, during his talk. It's the individuals after whom the Cato Institute is named. These are John Trenchard, Thomas Gordon. And they published a series of letters in the 1720s in London papers called Cato's Letters. The name Cato's Letters came from one of the famous Cato, I think it was Cato the Younger in Rome, who rather than submit to the tyranny of Caesar committed suicide. And Cato was seen, as I told you, these people had a tremendous interest in Roman and Greek history. Cato was seen as kind of the paradigm of the man of integrity who would rather die than submit to tyranny. Now, why are Cato's letters important? They're important because both Trenchard, particularly Trenchard, not so much Gordon, who later kind of sold out, but particularly Trenchard, was very much in this radical Whig, or this time radical Lockean tradition. They were journalists, and they wrote about the contemporary events of their time. They were journalists writing for papers, but they used Lockean theory to do it. And the letters were instantly picked up and republished in the colonies, and they were published and republished over and over again in newspapers in four volumes. They went through umpteen editions in the colonies. It is through Cato's letters primarily that the radical Lockean doctrine becomes infused into 18th century America. Americans, although they were far more literate as a whole and read far more complex literature than we do today, Americans in the 18th century, in a sense, weren't that much different. If you were a farmer or a merchant, you might not want to sit down and read a weighty tome like Locke's Two Treatises of Government. So it's not the case that every person in the colonies read Locke, but virtually anyone who was at all informed, who read the newspapers, read some form of Cato's letters. And it's through this more popularized version of radical Lockeanism, as people like Bernard Bailyn in his Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, Caroline Robbins, various historians point out, it's through this medium of popularized radical Lockean doctrine that the right of revolution, the theory of natural rights, is primarily through this medium that these ideas become transmitted to 18th century America. I'm not suggesting they didn't read Locke as well, but Cato's letters was far more widely read. Now, what were the essential ideas of this tradition? I want to run through them quickly. Well, first of all, and I'm glad Stuart Warner covered this stuff so well, because it means I won't have to go into the theoretical background, since he discussed rights and so forth already. First of all, there is the notion of natural rights, but in this tradition it wasn't just called natural rights, it was more commonly referred to as self-proprietorship or self-ownership. This becomes the major formulation of this entire tradition. It is found originally in the Levelers in this tradition. I will read you one example. It was written in 1646, and it was written by Richard Overton in one of these great pamphlets of wonderful titles, An Arrow Against All Tyrants. Overton wrote, quote, "To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For every one as he is himself, so he hath a self-propriety, or else he could not be himself. And on this no second person may presume to deprive any of, without manifest violation and affront to the very principles of nature and of the rules of equity and justice between man and man." Close quote. This idea of self-ownership or self-proprietorship receives its most famous formulation in John Locke's Two Treatises of Government, written 40 years later, where Locke said, every man has a property in his own person. Now, as Stuart explained, property here doesn't mean an item of property owned. It means moral jurisdiction over something, the right of use and disposal. To have property in your own person in this tradition meant that you have the right, the moral right of jurisdiction over your own body, over your own labor, and over the fruits of your labor. And to the extent that anyone else can lay claim to some part of your property, it has to be on the basis of your consent. Hence, we get into the famous idea of social contract, the justification of government supposedly being that we have to somehow consent to be ruled. Only in this way, it was argued, can government be justified. Now, the self-ownership argument weaves its way through America and becomes particularly important in the abolitionist or radical anti-slavery movement in the 19th century. I could give you literally dozens and probably hundreds of quotations where again and again the abolitionists say that the major moral complaint against slavery is that it's a form of theft. Slaveholders were commonly called man-stealers. That was the term Thomas Paine and every anti-slavery writer after him used. They were called man-stealers because they were said to steal from the slave that which was properly his own, his body, his labor, and the fruits of his labor. So the self-ownership concept becomes extremely important in that tradition. Let's move on to the next extremely important idea, and this has been covered by some of the economists, so again, I won't have to spend a lot of time on it. This is the idea, which is called by Hayek and many others, as spontaneous order. That is a social order which arises as a result of human action, but not as a result of any human design. A social order that results without central planning. Okay, why is this argument important in this tradition? It's important because these individuals advocating the right of revolution had to explain how it is that if a traditional government is overthrown, social chaos will not result. This was the primary challenge they faced, going all the way back to the middle of the 17th century when an obscure writer named Sir Robert Filmer said, in effect, if you radicals start with natural rights and consent and social contract, you're going to end up in what he called anarchy, by which he meant social chaos. And went on to say, prove to me you can start with these principles and still justify government. That's why John Locke wrote his two treatises, to try to prove it. That's why Algernon Sidney, which was also directed, his book was also directed against Filmer, wrote against Robert Filmer. That is why James Turrell, a close friend of Locke's, also wrote a very lengthy refutation of Filmer. This was the challenge. I call it Filmer's challenge. I call it the specter of anarchy argument. That hovering over this entire tradition is the specter of social chaos. And this charge was constantly brought against the radical revolutionaries, that you're going to disrupt the traditional order of society and it's going to collapse into social chaos. The most famous example of this debate, and if you're going to read anything that I recommend. Please read these. You may have already read them. They're required reading in a lot of classes. There is Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man and Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, this debate was over the French Revolution, not the American Revolution, but the principles are no more clearly expressed than in these two famous works, and justly famous. I disagree with Burke. I don't like Burke, but he was a brilliant writer, and he's well worth reading because he expressed extremely well that critique of the right of revolution. We have a very famous response by Paine in The Rights of Man, where he specifically uses the spontaneous order concept to defend the right of revolution. I'm going to give you just a brief example of how Paine phrased his reply to Burke in the course of rebutting the Reflections on the Revolution in France. Here's how Paine put it. He said, quote, "Great part of that order which reigns among mankind is not the effect of government. It had its origin in the principles of society and the natural constitution of man. It existed prior to government and would exist if the formality of government was abolished." Now note the last phrase, a very radical phrase. Social order, according to Paine, would continue to exist even if the formality of government was abolished. The mutual dependence, he argues, and reciprocal interest which man has upon man and all parts of a civilized community upon each other create that great chain of connection which holds it together. In fine, he concludes, society performs for itself almost everything which is ascribed to government. Close quote. He concludes by arguing that governments, so far from always being the cause or means of social order, are often the destruction of it. This was the essence of Paine's reply, an appeal to spontaneous order. He was saying to Edmund Burke, look, Edmund, you're claiming that if the government of France is overthrown, social chaos will necessarily follow as a matter of principle. I'm saying to you that more often than not, governments themselves are disruptors of social order, and getting rid of an evil or corrupt government can actually improve social order, the spontaneous order. Okay, that's the second major concept in this tradition that you really should understand as being essential to it. The third major concept I've already dealt with somewhat. I want to dwell a little bit more on it. The right of revolution. The right of revolution was probably the most important political implication of this entire tradition. And it was because of the right of revolution and the exercise of this right in the American Revolution and later in the French Revolution that there was a massive turning against of natural rights and social contract thinking. All of the major opponents of this natural rights social contract school, from David Hume in the middle of the 18th century, later to Edmund Burke, later to Jeremy Bentham, all of them were focusing on the radical implications of the right of revolution. Have you ever heard the famous phrase from Jeremy Bentham, the late 18th, early 19th century utilitarian, the father of modern utilitarianism, where he says, natural rights is nonsense upon stilts? Have you ever heard that phrase? The philosophers like to quote it as being a very kind of cute attack on natural rights theory. What many philosophers don't understand is where that phrase comes from. It comes from an essay which he wrote in his early career attacking the French Revolution and the principles on which it was based. The essay was later published under the title Anarchical Fallacies. Bentham used the same argument against natural rights that Filmer had done many years before, David Hume had done. He said, you start with these natural rights principles and you're going to end up in anarchy. That's why he called it Anarchical Fallacies. Utilitarianism in that time of day was a kind of a conservative counter-reaction against the more radical natural rights thinking. If you're a philosophy student or if you're a student of political theory, you might think that some kind of technical arguments were offered which destroyed the natural rights school. That simply isn't the case. There were not a lot of technical arguments given against natural rights thinking. The major objection, as I said, was a practical objection, that it would ultimately collapse governments and result in social chaos. Okay, now what was the view of revolution held by the American revolutionaries? It's the same view that was held throughout this tradition, beginning with the Levelers on through John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and so forth. Now, this theory of revolution was very sophisticated. In fact, I personally think a theory of the right of revolution is essential to modern libertarian theory because we're dealing with revolutions all over the world. And it's a gaping hole in modern libertarian theory. Exactly when is a revolution justified in, say, a third world country or in some little military dictatorship at some point in the place in the world? How should revolutions be conducted? What are the principles that should guide them? There's no such thing today as a libertarian theory of revolution in that sense. But there was a finely honed and well-developed theory of revolution held by 18th century Americans. And they got it basically from Locke and Sidney and from Cato's letters. Now, what I'm going to do is read to you the famous second paragraph, or most of it, from the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm sure all you've heard of this a million times, or maybe not, some of you haven't, but I want you to listen to this, not just as some kind of political propaganda piece, but as a serious piece of political philosophy, which it is, which summarizes the whole tradition of the right of revolution very succinctly. All right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, what do we have so far? First, a statement of natural rights. Secondly, a statement of social contract, consent being necessary, done in just a couple of sentences. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now we're getting into the right of revolution. The rest of this paragraph deals with the right of revolution. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Very important statement about prudence. The idea here was that a revolution should not create more evil than they're trying to cure. The idea here is that revolution is the last stop of self-defense. You use revolution only when all peaceful means have failed and when there's no hope for peaceful resolution. This was not, as someone like Edmund Burke would claim, the right of indiscriminate revolution. They believed that you did have the right, but only after peaceful attempts had failed. Okay, now it gets very important. Now listen to these next lines, and these lines are critical to this whole tradition, and yet they're often glossed over and not appreciated. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, this is from Algernon Sidney, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Probably the most single important line in this entire paragraph. Let me read it again. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design, now note the word design, to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now, I won't read the rest of that. I want you to think about that last line. The point here was, according to this tradition, one had to show that governments were not just guilty of isolated cases of injustice, because they held the theory that human beings are fallible and even the best government will make mistakes. There'll even be malicious people in government, but that doesn't mean the government itself deserves to be overthrown. Essential, key to this tradition, was the idea that a government had not only to commit injustices, but you had to be able to show that these injustices were not isolated, unrelated acts, that they were in fact hooked up into a grand scheme or a conspiracy, as it was called, to enslave or to violate inalienable rights. This is essential. After this paragraph, you may recall in the Declaration, Jefferson goes on to list a long list of grievances against George III. You all remember that? Why does he do that? He's trying to show a pattern. Since 1763, he says, all these grievances have occurred, and there's so many of them, they're so bad, that clearly we have to assume there's a design involved here. This design was essential to show the right of revolution. By the way, you'll find some historians, I don't think so much anymore, but some older historians tend to think of these people as being paranoid because they keep talking about conspiracies all the time. I think Hofstadter wrote a book about something about the paranoid style in American politics. Well, they talked about conspiracy so much because that was so key to their whole idea of when a revolution was justified. And they didn't mean by conspiracy people plotting together in a dark room. They meant a conscious design, a purposeful plan. That's all they meant by it. But they believed that you had to be able to show that, or at least infer it from the actions in order to justify a revolution. Now, this brings me to a very important point. There was a very clear distinction held by these individuals between the right of resistance and the right of revolution. The right of resistance was simply resisting the authority of government in particular cases, and that was justified, they held, from 1763 on. The right of revolution, they held, became justified in 1776. So if you want to read a very good book on this, Pauline Maier wrote a very good book. She's in the Bernard Bailyn tradition. The name of the book is From Resistance to Revolution, and she explains this distinction in some detail. It was a very well worked out theory. Okay. Now, The last thing I want to discuss is something about this period, something a bit more difficult to put one's finger on. It's not a theory, it's not an idea, it's an attitude. We're talking about the 18th century in America, and even in England to some extent. We're talking about the 18th century mind. How does one understand the mind of the 18th century American? How did the 18th century American see the world? Or at least how did these radical Whigs in the 18th century see the world? I've kind of troubled over this problem as to how to express this. You have to read a lot of the original material quite to appreciate it. What I've done to try to communicate their attitude is to pick out a few admittedly anecdotal cases, but which I think, generally speaking, illustrate the sort of attitude these people had. Let's take, first of all, the issue of smuggling in the American colonies. Now, smuggling was extremely widespread, as you probably know. The British complained about it for years. In fact, over half of England's own tea was smuggled into England. So if they couldn't stop smuggling in England, it was unlikely they could stop it in America. A lot of this had to do with the monopoly enjoyed by the East India Company on the importation of tea into England. The government then taxed the tea highly, trying to get its share of the take, and consequently, with the price that high, smuggled tea became very profitable. There was, in the American colonies, up until the Revolution, a system, and Leonard will be going through this, you've probably heard of it, a system of economics or economic regulation known as mercantilism. This was the theory of British colonialism, that one had colonies basically in order to produce raw materials for the mother country, which would then produce the finished materials. They wanted colonies for the production of raw materials. A lot of restrictions were placed on what you could make. A lot of restrictions were placed on what you could export, where you could import something from. This whole complex system of regulations, which Adam Smith called mercantilism, was something the Americans became very much opposed to. Why did they become opposed to it? Well, there's a period in American history that runs roughly from 1720, during the age of Walpole, when he was Prime Minister of England, to around 1763. This was called by Edmund Burke the period of salutary neglect. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this phrase. The idea behind this phrase, salutary neglect, was that although these mercantilist regulations were on the books, they were very loosely enforced, if at all. Because under the Walpole administration in England, Walpole was one of these old moderate Whigs, kind of a corrupt politician. He put all of his relatives in office, gave them cushy jobs, and they kind of sat around and didn't really enforce much of anything. The Americans got used to this way of doing business. They simply bribed customs officials to look the other way. If a customs official was unfortunate enough to actually bring charges, typically a colonial court would acquit the smuggler, and they would turn around and fine the customs official for like double or treble damages. The customs could not be enforced, customs acts could not be enforced in the American colonies when they tried to crack down after 1763. In 1764, you have the Sugar Act, 1765, the Stamp Act. There's this whole series of parliamentary regulations. Why did these occur around 1763? Well, what happened in 1763? Formally, the so-called 7 Years' War ended. France was kicked out of North America by Britain, and in the process, and it was really a world war. It's called the 7 Years' War on a world scale. It's called the French and Indian War in America. France was kicked out of America, North America, and Britain became the premier imperial power in the world, displacing France, which had formerly been the strongest imperial power. What happened was, in the course of winning this war, Britain accumulated the largest war debt largest national debt it had ever had, and it was very concerned about paying this debt off. Then there came into the British administration a lot of hardliners, like Lord Bute, later Lord Halifax, who was the head of the Board of Trade, who said, in effect, these colonials have to pay their fair share. We fought this war partly for them. We have soldiers we have to maintain over there to protect the frontiers against Indians and that sort of thing, and it's only fair that they should pay it. The colonials said they already were paying it through the severe mercantilist regulations, which it's estimated probably added one-third to the price of commodities bought in America. They said, we are paying it through these mercantilist regulations. You have no right to tax us directly, hence the great debate over taxation. But, and this is a bit of a digression, but the point here is that smuggling, because of these mercantilist regulations, becomes very profitable. And the British try to crack down after around 1767 with the so-called Townshend Acts. They appoint new commissioners of the customs to come over and try to really crack down on these rebels. What they couldn't understand, what the British commissioners couldn't understand, is why very respectable people like John Hancock were involved in smuggling. You know, one time an agent went aboard one of John Hancock's sloops called the Liberty. Not only was there all kinds of smuggled goods on board, but there was a customs agent who was securely locked in a cabin below, you know, out of harm's way, as they like to say. So I think one way to appreciate the extent to which smuggling went on is not to look what the Americans said about it, but to look at what the British customs agent said about it. Consider this letter that was sent by an English customs official back to England complaining about the problem of enforcing customs in America. Quote, "In this country, an officer of the customs ought to see his way very clear before he ventures to make a seizure, because he is sure of having every possible difficulty thrown in his way. He is looked upon as an enemy to the community and treated accordingly. And whether he succeeds or not, he is sure never to be forgiven and thinks himself fortunate if his punishment is deferred to a future day." Consider the complaints of Joseph Harrison, who was collector for the port of Boston. Quote, "Large quantities of dutiable goods have been smuggled in a most audacious manner, but though publicly known and talked of, such is the temper of the times that no legal information could be obtained so as to prosecute or make any seizure of them." Now you see, basically I think these customs officials were quite right. Smuggling was rampant, and it was supported by entire communities. There was a very little respect for the law. I'm going to give you another example which is a bit more colorful. This one's taken from England around the same period. It's not an example from America, but as I said, smuggling in England was rampant. And there's a case of the so-called revenue cutter, the Speedwell, which in 1789, a little later period, confiscated a smuggling vessel carrying smuggled goods in England. Now it turns out that the captain of the smuggling vessel was not on board at the time. He's probably from some little village in England. He wasn't on board, but his men were captured and put in jail. Now the reason I like this quotation, first of all, it gives you kind of a common man's view of what was involved in the customs duties and the pro-smuggling attitudes. The thing most significant is that it shows clearly that there's no sense of legitimacy given to these laws by these individuals. These are not people who think they're doing something wrong. They have no sense that they're doing anything wrong. They have the sense that they're free traders. That's what smugglers call themselves, free traders. And they have the sense that the real criminals, in fact, are the government enforcers of these anti-smuggling laws. Listen how this very simple man who ran his own little smuggling sloop addressed a letter to the captain of the Speedwell, the government ship that had confiscated his ship, taken his goods, and seized his men. Rather colorful letter, in my opinion. "Sir, damn thee and goddamn thy two blind eyes. Thou bugger, thou death-looking son of a bitch." This is kind of a popular version of this philosophy, you see. "Oh, that I had been there with my company for thy sake, when thou tookest them men of mine on board the Speedwell cutter on Monday ye 14th of December. I would drove thee and thy gang to hell, where thou belongest, thou devil incarnate. Go down, thou hellhound, unto the kennel below, and bathe thyself in that sulphurous lake that has been so long prepared for such as thee. For it is time the world was rid of such a monster. Thou art no man but a devil, thou fiend, O Lucifer. I hope you will soon fall into hell like a star from the sky, there to lie unpitied and unrelented of forever and ever, which God grant of his infinite mercy. Amen." This should really be printed up and called an ode to free trade or something. But you kind of get the point. There's an attitude expressed here. You see, it's hard to, unless you read this literature, it's hard to appreciate how spunky these people were. He obviously is not feeling too guilty about being a smuggler here. I'll give you a couple other examples of this. Going back to America, when the Federalists, under the Federalist administration of John Adams, when the Federalists first started trying to impose direct taxes in the 1790s, there was a fellow named Nathaniel Ames, who was a radical Jeffersonian, who wrote what is, to my knowledge, filled in the first tax protest form. In other words, they came to tax him for his, it was a tax on house and land and such. They came to assess him for taxes, and he had to fill out this form, and he kind of did it under protest. You know, this whole business going on today, if you file now and put a protest on it, they can fine you $500 or something. Well, this, to my knowledge, is the first example in America of a protest tax form. Here's how he fills it out. This is January 23rd, 1799. Nathaniel Ames. Called on by Nehemiah Fales for dimensions of my house and windows and list of land for direct tax of high Federalist tyrant government. I introduce it thus. Nathaniel Ames, regretting the short dawn of rational liberty under the Confederation, deploring the blindness and apathy of that people who once dared to defy and trample on the minions of foreign tyrants, only to be trampled on by domestic traitors, an impudent junto breaking the limits of their sovereign, that is God, greeted with the tyrant songs of energy of the government, tighten the reins of government, only to stifle the cheering sound of the great sovereign's voice, forced to yield instead of to law to the mighty powers that be, exhibits this list and description of his house and land on the first day of October, 1798. He concludes that the great sovereign grumbles at an unconstitutional tax. Now there again you see that kind of attitude that's expressed by these people. I'll be going into a bit about Jefferson's attitude. Let me talk about Jefferson just a minute. When Jefferson got into power in 1800, so-called Revolution of 1800, he was appalled by how the federal bureaucracy had grown under the Federalists. I mean, he was just appalled. He went into government and said, he called it, in effect, a bloated bureaucracy. The words Jefferson used to describe the Federalist bureaucracy when he got in power were, it's too complicated, too expensive. And he said the offices and people had unnecessarily multiplied. Now, that's an interesting phrase. We talk about big government today. But what, to Jefferson's mind in the 18th century, was big government? What did that mean? Okay. Well, let's take an example, and this is just one of many, of what Jefferson considered a government too complicated, too expensive, that it unnecessarily multiplied. The War Department had one secretary, one accountant, 14 clerks, and 2 messengers. The Attorney General had no clerk whatsoever. He had to write his own letters. This is a bloated bureaucracy by Jefferson's standard. As another example, when James Madison was president after Jefferson, he wrote to the elder statesmen of the Republicans asking his advice during the War of 1812 as to what kind of emergency war tax would the American people bear. Jefferson said, you might be able to get away with 1% general tax, but never go higher than that. He said 1.5%, you're going to have a revolution on your hands. These people were not very tolerant of this sort of direct taxes and such. So by the standards of today, or by the standards of the 18th century, I should say, we are living, by Jefferson's standards, we're living under a tyrannical form of government, whether it's democracy or not. I think it's important to understand this. In quantitative terms, the rate of taxation, the amount of money that's actually taken from individuals today would have, the revolution was fought over far less money than that, far less percentage of income than what we talk about today. Indeed, as Herbert Spencer pointed out in the 19th century, the serf in medieval times only had to give up about 1/3 of his earnings to the feudal lord. And one thing that bothered Spencer when he talked about England collapsing back into feudalism was that the English people were ending up paying a lot more in taxes than 1/3 of their income. And in that sense, in a proportional sense, they were worse off than a feudal serf under an overlord. Okay. I've gone through some of the basic ideas and attitudes of these people. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about the war itself. I think it's important that we touch on this. I think the philosophy is important, but let's talk about the war itself. Certainly ideas are important, but there's more involved than just ideas here. What can we say about the American Revolutionary War? Well, on the one hand, we can be sympathetic to it to a certain extent because it was fought, for the most part, with certain principles that we may be in general agreement with. But on the other hand, we should recognize that it was a real, honest-to-God war. And more than a war against an imperialist power, it was a civil war. Possibly 1/3 of the Americans were loyalists, and many of them fought on the side of the British. Now, the British drastically overestimated the number of loyalists in America. One reason that they did not send over more troops was that they thought that once they got the Hessians and some British troops over here, that the loyalists would all come out and flock to their banner, and they would be able to defeat the revolutionaries, or insurgents as they like to call them, using mainly domestic loyalists. This is one of the great mistakes that the British ministry made, underestimating the amount of support there was for the revolution. But as I said, it was a war. It was a civil war. A lot of people were killed. A lot of people were left homeless. There was brutality on both sides. And the result of most wars is that after the war is over, you're left with a burdensome war debt. That's what happened in the case of the American Revolution. So on the one hand, we can say that the American Revolution was good, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that the results of the American Revolution, with this burdensome war debt, led directly to the installment of certain, later on, especially after ratification of the Constitution, led directly to a call for the centralization of government and to the centralizing of paying off the war debt, the so-called assumption under the Hamiltonians. I'll get into that later on. So it's important to understand that the revolution had bad consequences as well, as any war does. And one can trace a lot of the centralizing tendencies after the war to the results of the war, to its war debt in particular. There were also very tricky questions. As you know, I'm sure you know, the Continental Congress tried printing up paper money. This stuff became so worthless that they stopped that fairly quickly. Not worth a continental, you've heard that expression. How then do you get your supplies and requisitions to fight a war? They started essentially confiscating goods. And when they couldn't confiscate them, they paid for them in certificates, kind of IOUs. Sometimes they were interest-bearing, sometimes not. After the war is over, the question is, what happens to these certificates? The federal government had no direct authority to tax. It had no direct authority to tax under the Articles of Confederation. The major argument against the Articles of Confederation was that they did not give to the central or federal government the power to tax. Therefore, what happened to these IOUs, these certificates? What happened was that there arose a market, a speculative market in these certificates. Many people bought up these certificates, speculators bought them up at maybe 10 cents on the dollar. In other words, you're a poor farmer, your goods have been confiscated, you've been given this worthless certificate that you know can't be paid off because the federal government doesn't have any power to raise money. What do you do with it? A speculator comes along and he says, look, you've got a bunch of this paper, I'll take it off your hands for 10 cents on the dollar. You sell it. All right. Well, what do you suppose happens after a while? Well, there's certain people get in power who realize that there's a lot of money to be made here. That if the government does in fact get the power to tax under the Constitution, a lot of people are going to get very, very rich. This is the claim made by Charles Beard in his famous economic interpretation of the Constitution. I should mention, however, as Beard points out, that it was not original with Beard. Thomas Jefferson made the same argument against the Hamiltonians, Alexander Hamilton and his followers, that in fact Hamilton and his people leaked information that these certificates would be funded at face value. This was the great debate. You've got these certificates later on. Should you redeem them at their face value, at their market value? Should the federal government redeem them a dollar for a dollar, or should they just pay the market value? Madison wanted the original bearers to get the full amount, but he wanted those who speculated in them only to get what they paid for them. It's a question. I mean, I had one person ask me one time, well, shouldn't there have been a free market in these shouldn't the government have respected the face value of this currency? Well, no, for a couple of reasons. First, they had to tax other people to pay it off. And secondly, clearly there was a conspiracy of sorts to leak information to certain people who then went out and bought these certificates up and made huge fortunes virtually overnight once the government decided to redeem them at face value. This was the great scheme of Alexander Hamilton. I'm not saying this is the reason Hamilton did it personally, but certainly there were people around there, around the Hamiltonian circle that knew of this, knew that there was high probability that these would be refunded at face value, and made a fortune very, very fast off the redemption of these certificates at face value. That is the so-called economic interpretation of the Constitution, if you've heard that phrase. That a lot of the motive for ratifying the Constitution related to the payment of these certificates at face value. Okay, I'm going to deal with it a little bit when I get into the conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton. Now, let me go back to the war a second. From a military point of view, of course, a lot's been written on the military side of the American Revolution. Let me just discuss one of the major debates that's now going on, has been going on for some years. This is a debate between the relative efficacy of the Continental Army in America under Washington and the militia system. America, up until the Revolution, did not have a standing army, did not have a professional organized army. A standing army is an army maintained in peacetime. Virulently opposed by this whole radical Whig tradition. Jefferson, in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, Jefferson wanted a provision in the Bill of Rights prohibiting standing armies in America. In other words, if Jefferson had his way, the United States Army would be unconstitutional in peacetime. That's how much they disliked the standing army, because they were convinced that armies would be used to enforce the unjust decrees of a tyrant upon his own people, because it had happened so many times before. So America did have a militia system, and there was an element of conscription involved in this militia system, although it was very easy to get out of. It wasn't really strict enforcement. You had basically two schools of thought. Murray Rothbard talks about this in his 4 volumes, Conceived in Liberty. Although I must say, as much as I like those volumes in some way, I think his discussion is somewhat misleading. But there were two schools of thought primarily about the relative efficacy of the militia. George Washington hated the militia. I mean, just despised the militia. He thought they were undisciplined. You couldn't rely on them. He believed that they would flee under the charge of the British bayonets. The British soldiers were renowned not for shooting, but for their bayonet charges. They were feared throughout Europe, and in any battle they got into, these guys would put these bayonets on. You couldn't shoot the musket with a bayonet on it. It went into the muzzle. But many times they wouldn't even load the muskets. They would simply do the bayonet charge. And because of the slow loading of muskets in those days, you could get one volley off before the bayonets got to you. So you have to have very disciplined soldiers if you're going to stand there, fire once, and then while these professional soldiers come charging with bayonets. You also have to have a good deal of discipline if you're in the front row of the English line doing the charging. This is called an age of civilized warfare, by the way, and it was in a way, because at least in theory it was believed that warfare should be limited to armed combatants, to uniformed combatants. It wasn't unusual in some cases in Europe and even in America for individuals to go out and sit on hilltops to watch the fighting. It was considered that you did not simply, I'm not saying they never did it, but in theory you did not go around ravaging the countryside, you did not go around looting from private individuals. One reason the British Army was so slow moving in America, for example, when General Howe was criticized for not pursuing Washington after smashing him in New York, when Washington fled to the Jerseys, one reason that Howe did not do that is because he had to maintain a supply line. And according to the ideas of 18th century warfare, you did not extend your troops out past 5 miles of your supplies. They wanted to maintain a steady supply line. They did not go around the countryside foraging, and, as they called it, and stealing from the people. They did that sometimes. But even the British soldiers, oftentimes, when they did that, would pay for it, and they paid usually in gold or something that was worth something, unlike the Americans who give them these worthless notes. Well, let me mention, I know I'm digressing a bit here, but there's several important points here. The British were by far the most powerful military power in the world. There's no question about it. And one thing about Professor Rothbard's interpretation I disagree with is he tends to make fun or poke fun at the fighting ability, this kind of lining up in rows, and you kneel down and you shoot and you fall down, and the other side shoots. And you have cases during the 7 Years' War of the French officer saying, "You shoot first," it gives the other side the first volley. And of course, the officers stand off to the side while this is going on. One reason the officers stood off to the side was not only because they didn't want to get shot, it was also because they would shoot anyone who broke ranks. One reason for this close formation fighting, we've seen this in the movies where they all line up and the front row's down like this and the other side's reloading. One reason they did that is because if they let many of these soldiers were conscripts, and if they let them run off into the forest and break ranks, they would desert. They had the same problem with the Hessians, who were basically conscripts brought over from Germany. So there are various reasons why they use this close formation order. And this is discussed quite a bit in the literature. But now, why couldn't the British defeat this ragtag band, as it was called, of Americans? Well, I think they could have defeated them. I think there's no question. But if Britain really wanted to put all their forces into America, they could have easily defeated the rebels. There were a couple of problems, however, aside from the thing I mentioned before. And one of them was that they had very bad strategic thinking. They underestimated colonial resistance. That's one problem. The second problem is they fought what's called a war of posts. It was called a war of posts in the 18th century. And this was even recognized, the danger of this was recognized by an aide to General Howe, when Howe was still the commander-in-chief, Ambrose Cyril, that's S-E-R-L-E, who was a secretary or an aide to General Howe. Now, when Howe captured Philadelphia, and I'm just using this as an example, when the British captured Philadelphia, they went into the city, all the loyalists came out of the woodwork, right? Because the loyalists are all mixed up with the rebels. They come out of the woodwork and they cheer the British and they support them, they give them food, supplies, and so forth. Fine. Then what do the British do? They evacuate Philadelphia. They don't leave any British garrison there. What happens if you're a loyalist now? You're standing there and you're looking at all your neighbors. You start packing up and quietly moving out. And you see your friends starting to get the tar and feathers ready. In other words, what the British did time and again was to go into a city, conquer it, and then leave after the loyalists had come out to support them. Now, that was not very good strategy. Cyril pointed out in his diary, Cyril wrote a very interesting diary about his couple of years in America during the war. When he got news that the British were to evacuate Philadelphia, he said, the war is lost. This is fairly early in the war. He said, the war is lost. He said, the loyalists will get around. No American loyalists will come out and support us openly when we conquer an area because they know we're going to take off, and then they're going to be left to the ravages of the rebels. There were ravages. I mean, the rebels were not at all pleased to see their neighbors coming out and supporting the British. You'd seen your house destroyed, you'd seen your crops destroyed, you'd seen members of your family killed, and here you have your neighbors coming out supporting the British. Well, once those British left, you can imagine what happened in many cases. The other problem, and this is a very serious problem, after the Battle of Saratoga, where General Burgoyne was defeated, the Battle of Saratoga is extremely important because it persuaded the French to come in officially on the side of the Americans and aid the Americans. The Americans did not have a naval fleet to speak of, and the assistance of the French, although they had been assisting covertly before, the open assistance of the French was extremely important. It wasn't so much because of the naval power of the French as it was because France now was at war with England, and so was Spain. After the Battle of Saratoga, after the British were faced with the French and the Spanish, they were in a world war. The American Revolution turned into a world war. There was serious discussion once France and Spain declared war on England. There was serious discussion in England about pulling all troops out of America altogether. They simply were not that important compared to the possibility of invasion from France across the Channel. You see what I'm getting at here? Once France came into the war, it wasn't because they did that much in the actual fighting. It was because the more troops that were brought from Britain, the weaker Britain was, and therefore France, just across the Channel, posed an immediate and very dangerous threat. The will to fight, so to speak, began to lessen in England once they realized that they themselves might be subject to invasion. Now, after the Battle of Yorktown, which was really was possible to win because of the French blockade, which did not allow Cornwallis to escape, after the Battle of Yorktown, the British could have kept on going. But it was simply too costly, it was too expensive, and it was a political decision, rather like withdrawing from Vietnam, that sort of thing. And had the British made better decisions, had they not had to worry about the French and the Spanish, there's no question. I think it's rather ridiculous to suggest, as some writers have, that there's no way that the British could have conquered America. These are the same soldiers that conquered Napoleon. Many of these same people went over and fought in Europe and defeated Napoleon. I just find it incredible to think that somehow the spirit of independence and a small group of rebels can hold off forever a mighty power. I just think, I wish that were true, but it seems to me rather wishful thinking. We simply have too many cases to the contrary. So, as much as I admire the kind of fighting spirit and guerrilla tactics and all this with the Americans, I think we have to keep these realities in mind as to why probably why America won. Let me finish up this little digression on some of the military aspects of the war by pointing out that one of the great strategists of the war was a man named Nathaniel Greene, who conducted the Southern campaign, which was the last phase of the war. The thing that was important about Greene was he appreciated the role of the militia. And he used militiamen very, very effectively, but he combined them with the regular army. There were several very important battles where Greene recognized that these untrained militia, who were oftentimes real sharpshooter types, now you understand there were rifles during this period. I'm not sure how much you know about weaponry. It's not too complicated, but the difference between a rifle and a so-called smoothbore musket is that the rifles have a grooving inside, which puts a spin on the bullet and provides much greater accuracy when you shoot. So you hear, these stories of Kentucky backwoods riflemen, this sort of thing. Well, they did exist, and they really could shoot several hundred yards and hit something very small. They were a threat. They were picked off. They would sit in the trees and pick off the British officers and that sort of thing, which the British thought was very bad sportsmanship because this wasn't in the rules of warfare. I don't know if you could have won a war with those people, but certainly they were good for picking off people. But they weren't the type that were going to stand there because the rifles were much harder to load. They had a much tighter muzzle to them. They were much more difficult to load. They were far less reliable in wet weather. They would tend to jam a lot more. So basically, the riflemen, or often in the militia, could be used to get off one good round, and then they'd run because you don't have time to put the bayonets on. What are you going to do? Stand there and get bayoneted? Here's Washington berating the militia as being cowards, but realistically, what are you going to do? So the one thing about Greene that Greene did, he had a more sense about him. He used the militia very effectively. In some of his battles, he'd put a militia line in front, and then he'd put the regular army in back. He'd tell the militia, or the riflemen, he'd say, get one good shot off and then take off. Behind our lines, and then the regular army will take over. That's how he used militia, the Battle of Cowpens and battles like this. He combined the militia with the regular army, had very effective results. Far better strategist than Washington ever was. Washington was not, in case you don't know it, a very good general. He never won any battles. He got down to Yorktown in time to take credit for it. Sailed down, here I am, with George Washington. The only battles Washington won were Trenton and Princeton. The famous crossing of the Delaware. And those are the only battles he won. He lost every major battle he was in. Those were not really major conflicts. And he attacked on Christmas Eve when the Germans were drinking. And that was considered a violation of civilized war. You just didn't attack on Christmas Eve. It was kind of, it's just kind of tacky. So anyway, it was a rather brilliant maneuver, and he captured some Germans and this sort of thing. But Washington was picked to be commander-in-chief not because of his military experience. He had very little. He fought under Braddock in the 7 Years' War and managed to lose a battle there too. That's the only experience he had. John Adams, who was kind of a curmudgeonly type. You know this story about George Washington, and he didn't really want to be commander-in-chief, and oh gosh, if you want me to, I'll do it for my country. Sitting around saying shucks, gee, thank you, but really unexpected honor. John Adams was a little cynical about Washington's motives. He observed that Washington, despite all of his denials of wanting to be high up in the military, when they were just debating who to put commander-in-chief, he said, isn't it strange that Washington, of all the delegates to the Continental Congress, was the only one who showed up every day in full military array? He suspected Washington's motives a bit. Did you see the special that was done on Washington? This little mini drama, whatever they call them. You remember a scene in there, and this was not a real accurate movie in a lot of ways. You remember a scene in there where they're executing some guy who was supposed to be a deserter, or a series of them, and Washington is wringing his hands and saying, gosh, we have to do this, but I wish we didn't have to. Washington was a real bastard when it came to punishment. The Continental Congress had to put restrictions on the number of lashes he could administer to men for the most trifling offenses. Washington was a great admirer of European-style armies, with the strict discipline that went with that. When Baron von Steuben, the Prussian military officer, came over and started drilling the Americans to make them into real soldiers, although he cut down on some of the tactical complexities, this is the type of army that Washington wanted. You see what I mean? He wanted a disciplined army, and to get a disciplined army, how are you going to take these frontiersmen, these militiamen who are used to electing their own officers, who are used to short enlistments and going home and tending their farms? How are you going to keep them in the army for 2 years? One thing they don't explain in that movie, a lot of these people who were being punished for so-called desertion simply wanted to leave after their voluntary term of enlistment was up. These people were farmers. They had farms to take care of. They would enlist perhaps for 3 months, and they'd want to leave. Well, Washington made the point, which is an interesting point, you can't fight a war if you have soldiers leaving every 3 months. You've got to have long-term enlistments. So when these people wanted to leave, they were told they couldn't. And if they still insisted, they were treated like deserters in many cases. So we shouldn't do too much hand-wringing over the torture Washington went through, supposedly, on this sort of thing. He was a very strict disciplinarian. He was despised by many of his soldiers. The common soldier thought the most competent military strategist was a man named Charles Lee. Charles Lee was a British officer who had fought extensively throughout Europe, came over to America to aid the American cause, as did a number of British soldiers, expected to be put in command of the American army, which probably he should have been if military experience alone had been considered. He, in fact, ended up third in command, which caused some bitterness. Washington ended up first for a number of reasons, the main one being that he was a prominent Virginian, and Virginia was kind of a conservative colony, and the radicals in Massachusetts wanted to make sure that Virginia would come over on the side of the Revolution. The theory was if you appoint Washington, who's a Virginian, you'll win Virginia over. He was a political appointee. Now, I'm not quite as hard on George Washington as someone like Murray Rothbard is. I mean, he did learn from his mistakes somewhat. He wasn't an evil man particularly. I don't think he was kind of an Eisenhower type when he got to be president. He didn't do a whole lot, and he tended to let his subordinates do a lot for him. But I'll be dealing with the Washington administration later. But as a military point, Washington made some very, very bad strategic blunders. He didn't use his cavalry, and here you have someone like Charles Lee telling him, you know, this is not right. You're not dealing with this right at all. And Lee made some brilliant maneuvers. He saved the Charleston in the initial phase of the war when the British wanted to invade Charleston. He built up the fortifications there. He was really quite a brilliant strategist. So there's this Charles Lee versus George Washington controversy. Charles Lee appreciated far more than Washington the role of the militia, that these were free people. You could not force them into some kind of European conscript army, put uniforms on them and packs on their backs and make them stand in line and be shot. That these people were not, you can't, if you're fighting for a free country, you can't fight it on the principles of despotism and European armies. Although he did see a role for the professional army to some extent. But this is one of the great controversies. If you want to read someone who's kind of the pro-militia, read a historian named John Shy, S-H-Y, particularly a collection of essays called A People Numerous and Armed. There is this new school of historiography emerging which is beginning to appreciate the role of the militia in the American Revolution. And it's questioning whether the Continental Army really had that much of an impact. You see what I'm getting at? Traditional stories are George Washington, glorious victories. But other than Trenton and Princeton, really, what victories did George Washington win? Nothing, really. I mean, he lost battle after battle. And it was more owing to Nathaniel Greene, who was actually an admirer of Washington's and an appointee of Washington's, but it was largely owing to Nathaniel Greene's southern campaign against the British, where he combined the militia with the professional army, that finally drove the British to despair. So that's a little bit of the military aspect of that. Okay, with the time remaining, why don't I'm going to end here. I'll be getting into the Constitution and such in the next lecture. Why don't we have questions and stuff and just stay on the kind of the Revolutionary period? Yes?
First, thank you for the most interesting lecture. My question is this, could you not argue that Edmund Burke was more correct than wrong in the sense that as a result of the turmoil of the French Revolution, the French people were later plagued with an even greater turmoil in the bloody Napoleon period?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of people argue that. The best person to ask about this is Ralph Raico, who's really far more familiar with the details of the French Revolution than I am. But I'll tell you in general what my answer to that is. First of all, Burke was simply mistaken. Burke's attack on the French Revolution was riddled with factual errors. I mean, he didn't know what was going on in France. Paine pointed this out to him, as had many other people who'd been over there, that your facts were simply wrong. Now, he based his so-called predictions on these facts. His predictions, see, the point is that when you hate something that's going on, you don't usually predict wonderful consequences. If you're looking at something and saying, this is awful, you're usually going to say awful things are going to follow. I agree with you in the sense Burke was right. Awful things did happen from the French Revolution. But I would also argue it had to do with the concrete, specific chain of events that happened during the French Revolutionary period. There's no intrinsic reason why the principles on which the French Revolution was based had to lead to what Burke said they would lead to. You also have to take into account that long before England had gone to war with France, Burke was clamoring for a war with what he called Jacobin France, or atheistic France. He wanted Europe, with a coalition of other powers, to invade France. France, when did the terror and all this sort of stuff, like 1793, 94, what brought a lot of this about? A lot of it was brought about by the alliance of European powers pressuring France on her borders and the threat of war, the threat of invasion. Why did the Jacobins come into power over the more moderate Girondists, as they were called, the more moderate faction, the people we would be more sympathetic to? Why did the radical Jacobins, the Robespierre types? For one thing, they were anti-war, which they were the only party that was, because the war had started to devastate France. But you have to look at the historical conditions and the threat of invasion. The Reign of Terror occurs after this threat of invasion. There's panic. There's edicts by European monarchs that if they execute the king, when the European armies come through, Paris will be free ground to do anything the armies wish. You know, in other words, there's this idea that you can, if you do something bad, you can let loose like the Red Army. You let loose the Red Army, and they can rape, they can pillage, they can murder. This threat was facing France and Paris. The people panicked, and there was a lot of bad things happened. That was by no means the only problem. As Burke himself pointed out, the assignats, the issuing of this paper money, the so-called civil constitution, the demanding that the clergy declare allegiance to the state, that lost a lot of the support for the French Revolution. There are a lot of things that happened even after Burke wrote that Burke had no knowledge of, had no way of knowing what happened, that contributed greatly to the later events of the French Revolution and to the eventual rise of Napoleon. Usually when you see Burke quoted, they only quote his short passage about some military dictator will arise. But that was commonly believed in any revolution. He would have said that about any revolution. Yes?
Why did the American Revolution not go away as the Russian Revolution or even the French Revolution? Especially, how did the forefathers maintain control of the revolution?
Well, in some sense they didn't. There was no centralized control, and I think that had a lot to do with why the revolution succeeded. America was an extremely decentralized country in terms of the power structure. France was not. France had kind of a central area you could capture. Thomas Paine pointed out in some of his writing that one reason the British had trouble defeating America, as he wrote this during the war in the Crisis Papers, was that there was no central power, city of power that the British could capture and then say, we've won. You know what I mean? It was extremely decentralized. It was the same reason the English could not conquer the Irish for so many years, despite how many times they tried. They would conquer one tribe, and the guys say, okay, we give up. In the name of Ireland, we surrender. The English would go back, and no one paid any attention to it. There was no centralized power structure, no capital city. You couldn't march on Washington, D.C., so to speak. That's one reason, I think, that the revolution succeeded. But in terms of getting out of hand, if you mean getting out of hand in the sense of why it didn't erupt into violence like the French Revolution, there's a number of reasons for that. This is kind of hypothetical history, and we're doing kind of counterfactual history here. But one reason certainly is that there was not an established and landed aristocracy in America. There was not the bitterness. There were not the years of conflict and personal hatred that had developed in France. Also, the British could go home. You see what I'm saying? The British were viewed as primarily an alien power. There was some place for them to go. The French aristocracy, which had become so hated, were part of France, and they were viewed as, you tend to view people in your own country, in a sense, in worse terms than you do an alien invader. You kick the aliens out, they go back home, and you forget about them. But here you're dealing with fellow Frenchmen, you're dealing in a bloody civil war, and you have memories going back decades of persecution. And the bitterness was very, very intense. That didn't exist in America to any great extent. Even the attitude against the Loyalists was fairly mild. There were loyalty oaths imposed. There was persecution of Loyalists. There was confiscation of property. One thing I hold against Paine, as much as I like him in some ways, is he wrote virulently against the Quakers who wanted to remain neutral. Even Sam Adams was saying there are no neutrals in this war. You're either for us or you're against us. And perfectly peaceful people like the Quakers, who wouldn't even allow their people to engage in the production of war material, were persecuted by the Americans. There are a lot of bad effects of this war on neutrals. So it did happen to some extent. There was violence against neutrals. It did happen. But it didn't happen on a massive scale, and I think primarily because the British did leave. There was no longer an enemy there. There was no longer an established class. Yes?
Okay, you described the British as having the best army in the world.
Yes.
They did not mind conscripting people. They did not mind hiring mercenaries.
Yes.
They did not mind one of the points of your documentary you mentioned earlier was that you had all these idealized that, you know, when the freedom, revolution, and all this, when the war came about, then it was George, you go fight it, let us know how it comes out.
Yeah, that's the typical apology for Washington.
Well, you not agree with that, and if you do agree with that, haven't you been kind of tough on it?
No, because I mean, from Washington's point of view, he wasn't getting the supplies he needed and such. But there were a lot of people in the Continental Congress who were very suspicious of Washington. They did not want to give him a lot of power. He was at one point made a virtual dictator, or he was offered it. They didn't trust him because they didn't trust the military. Now, in Washington's case, maybe I'm being too hard on him because he did have a certain amount of integrity. There was this famous plot, supposedly, for a military overthrow of the United States government, and they wanted Washington to lead it, and he declined. He did have a sense of integrity about him on that level. I just don't think he was a very good military strategist. I suppose you could argue that the Continental Congress should have backed him up more given their own point of view. But there were the Sam Adamses, there were the radicals in the Congress who were very, very suspicious about giving the Army a lot of power. And they felt that it was a very dangerous thing to do, and they didn't feel it was necessary. I just don't think we should take poor George and read his letters how he's not getting the supplies for his troops. Remember, Washington himself lived very well during the war. I mean, he had a whole train of supplies. He drank wine. You know, this idea of Washington starving with his troops was not very accurate. And in fact, it's a kind of a funny story. You know, they wanted him to take this salary. There's a famous book called George Washington's Expense Account. They wanted him to take this salary. I don't know how much it was, $5,000 or something. They wanted him to take the salary, and he declined, saying, no, just pay my expenses. I'm service to my country. His expenses ended up being 10 times what his salary would have been. He drank very well. He ate very well. He was a Virginia aristocrat, basically, as you know. And he liked the good life, and he didn't exactly suffer too much a deprivation himself. And anyway, there's a lot of controversy there, and I'm not saying categorically. I mean, it's a complex situation. You can't just dismiss someone or embrace them totally. It's a mixed bag. But given that they wanted to fight a continental-style war, they should have supplied him better. Joy?
If there could have been a revolution, is that a war with a great deal of violence and
Well, you might have had some, but I don't think as much. In fact, I think had there been possibly a resolution without a war, liberty in America would have lasted much longer than it did. Let me explain why. See, in a sense, I think the American Revolution was a disaster because what it did is it kicked the British out. Now, the British, if you look at it in institutional terms, what happened in America before the American Revolution is you had basically two competing governments in America. You had the British, who usually controlled the governorships. I'm generalizing here about the colonies. There were variations, but they controlled the governorships and usually the upper houses of the assembly, of the colonial assemblies. You had the local governments, the colonial governments, which usually controlled the lower houses of the assembly. Now, the royal governor had the power of veto over virtually any law passed by the lower house, okay? The lower house usually controlled the purse strings of the governor. In other words, they controlled his salary. They had to vote on it every year. That's why when there was this attempt by England to make the salary of the governor independent of the legislatures, there was such an outcry, because this was a way of exercising control. Now, what happened during this period? And I mentioned the period of salutary neglect earlier, but it wasn't just salutary neglect. You had a real checks and balances operating here. There was a good deal of liberty during this period because you had two competing governments checking each other out, checking each other off. In other words, the British government was paralyzed and the colonial governments were paralyzed in many, many cases. The colonial governments wanted to print paper currency. The British government wouldn't let them. The British government wanted to impose taxes. The colonial governments wouldn't let them. You had two opposing forces, and I think a lot of liberty came out of that conflict. They were checking each other's power. What happened in effect when the British were kicked out of America is you now had a monopoly government. You had one government which didn't have to really worry about competition in the sense of the British system. And there was no real check after that point. The so-called division of powers in the American Constitution, the separation of powers, you have to understand that James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, you know, sometimes we get this view that these people have this unbounded faith in the Constitution. That's simply not true. These people were smart people. Thomas Jefferson expected that the American system would degenerate within 100 or 200 years, and liberty would be lost. They had a certain view of history, and they really believed that liberty was almost impossible to maintain indefinitely, that it would be lost at least in a couple hundred years. But they thought they could kind of stave it off for a while through the separation and division of balance of powers. But in a famous letter, in a very good letter, Madison wrote to Jefferson. He said, look, they're talking about the checks and balance system. Madison says, you know, the judicial branch, the executive branch, the legislative branch, these are not going to encroach on each other's power. Each branch will go out into the public sphere and encroach on the public power. He said, the real problem of checks and balances is not how to keep these branches of government from encroaching on each other. Rather, how do we keep the government as a whole, in all three of its branches, from growing out into the public sector? They were very pessimistic that it could be done. When the federal constitution was proposed, Jefferson was in France. He was initially opposed to it. They more or less compromised the Jeffersonians by accepting a Bill of Rights being attached, as you may know, to the Constitution. That's the way they got around it. But Jefferson said, after he got a copy of the Constitution, when there was originally no Bill of Rights, he wrote a letter and he said, you know, I would hope that liberty in America would have taken at least 200 years for us to lose it. He said, I'm afraid now that it's been lost in a course of a decade. That was his reaction to the Constitution when he first saw it. Okay, we have time for one or two more. Who hasn't said something here? Okay, yeah.
As I understand it, prior to the actual war, there was a real problem between Virginia and Massachusetts, in that the Virginians really considered the Massachusetts people to be a bunch of hotheads and real radicals. And I'm wondering whether there was this difference in philosophy and whether it might have contributed to the replacing of the Massachusetts first commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Forces with a Virginia.
Yes. Well, see, the Massachusetts delegation to the Continental Congress, John, Sam Adams, et cetera, were very aware of this. As Adams once said, I am obnoxious, unpopular, and suspected. The radicals were perceived to be centered around Boston. The English saw them this way. Many of the other colonials saw them this way. And in the Continental Congress, the radicals came from primarily New England, but particularly the Boston area in Massachusetts. There were a few radicals like Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. The Virginia delegation, by the way, was quite radical. They had Richard Henry Lee. Jefferson substituted for him when Lee went back. They had a rather radical delegation. In fact, Virginia had declared independence from Britain even before America as a whole had declared independence. There was a Declaration of Independence passed in the Virginia legislature. And Richard Henry Lee's Declaration of Independence, his resolution, was based on that prior Virginia resolution. So they're in a sense you're right, in a sense you're not. The delegation from Virginia was quite radical, but Virginians as a whole were perceived as being a more conservative colony. They had more to lose, they thought, in terms of their plantation, their slaves. It suggested that one reason that the South went into the war was that they wanted to get rid of their debts to England. They figured after the Revolution they would no longer have to pay off their debts to English merchants. By the way, I should point out that the contemporaries of the time were well aware of these kind of economic motives that were involved in the war. But yes, Washington was perceived as a kind of stable, calm fellow from Virginia, and they knew if they put someone from New England in, he'd be very suspect. Yeah.
Risk of applying the weapons of history to perhaps a non-parallel event. Could suggest in Afghanistan, for instance, that you've got something that I guess approaches the Hessians, the goons, if you will, and that the Afghans were able to circulate among the Russians in an incredible fashion, and all they have to do is desert, and they can go to the country of their choice and everything, that the Russians would have a real problem on their hands. What was the situation with, in a parallel fashion with respect to Hessians and others in America at the time, if they decided to sort of melt off into the woods?
If the Hessians did?
The Hessians or anybody else?
A lot of the Hessians did desert when they got here.
With open arms, was that an effective?
Yeah, in effect. The Americans were quite willing to accept these people when they deserted. In fact, one prediction was a large portion of the Hessian force would desert. I'm not sure a lot of statistics are available on this, but clearly there was a large German population in America during that period, which kind of came from the Hessians deserting, because these poor guys were just picked up off of farms in Germany and sold, in effect. I mean, they were basically slaves or serfs or whatever you want to call them, and they were trained under extremely brutal conditions. I mean, understand the psychology of this, going back to this close order formation. You know, one reason they had them in a close order formation, and this came from a lot of Frederick the Great's ideas about warfare, was that it was such an absurd situation to be in, where when you're kneeling and you're not very far from the line and you're going to fire at each other. How do you keep those people calm, and how do you keep them from breaking ranks, aside from the threat of being shot by your own commander if you do? One idea was you keep them touching each other. If you look at those formations, their foot or their kind of the calf here, they're actually touching physically. And the theory was quite sophisticated. It was if you feel yourself part of the mass, and so to speak, that's not how they put it, but if you can feel yourself part of the larger group, the tendency to run away, to be afraid, will be far less. Whereas if you feel yourself separate, if you had the space between you, you would feel far more isolated and be far more likely to let the fear overcome you and then flee. That's a little bit of a digression, but it's kind of an interesting psychological point about warfare. But there was a great temptation. A lot of the British soldiers deserted. But let's not underestimate. A lot of these people were, and once they got into the service, once they were there, they were very dedicated professional and competent soldiers. There's no question about that. Okay, let's take one more, then we'll close for the break. Any other last? Yeah.
The earlier libertarian thinkers stressed the right of revolution. Did they also, or this probably too early for them to think about a right of intervention? In other words, the right to free a peoples who were oppressed, you know, in an adjoining country or province or whatever.
Generally speaking, no. It depends on the party you're dealing with. The Federalists were interventionists. The Jeffersonians rejected interventionism. They supported the right of the private individual to go over voluntarily and assist, but they did not want Americans getting involved in entangling alliances, as Washington said in his farewell address. The phrase, have you ever heard the phrase, as much economic connection between nations as possible, as little political connection?
Going back towards the radical Whigs, on back.
No, generally speaking, they were extreme isolationists. They wanted, first of all, they didn't trust in order to do that, you have to have a standing army. You have to have professional. One objection of the British during the 7 Years' War was that the American militia, they were fine for local defense, but they wouldn't march into Canada and conquer Canada. Well, they didn't want to. They wanted to stay close to home. The idea of a militia system, which was essential to this radical Whig tradition, was that they were great for defense, but they couldn't be used for wars of aggression, for sending overseas, and so that, in that sense, this whole tradition is extremely isolationist. Okay, let's close for a break.